The year was 1879, and the air in the village was thick with the damp scent of earth and smoke. It was a place where people lived and died quietly, where births were celebrated with bells and deaths were mourned with silence. But the silence was broken one night when a boy named Samuel, barely 6 years old, spoke words that no child should ever know. It happened in his grandmother's cottage, a small dwelling of timber and stone, lit only by the dull glow of a dying fire. His grandmother, pale and frail, had been fading for weeks, her breaths shallow, her eyes glassy. Samuel was kneeling beside her bed when he suddenly leaned close and whispered, "I am not ready to leave, but the river calls me. Tell my son I forgive him." The words were not his own. The voice was Samuel's, yes, but the tone, the weight, the sorrow, it belonged to his grandmother. A moment later, she exhaled one final sigh, her body falling still. Samuel sat motionless, his small hands trembling, his eyes wide with terror at what had escaped his lips. His mother, who had been standing in the doorway, dropped the basin she carried. Water spilled across the floor, mixing with the ashes that had fallen from the hearth. She stared at Samuel as though she had never seen him before. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice brittle. But Samuel could not answer. He only shook his head and wept. News spread quickly. In villages like theirs, whispers traveled faster than the wind. Neighbors gathered at the door, their faces lined with suspicion and fear. Some said the boy had been touched by God, chosen to carry the voices of the dying into the world of the living. Others muttered darker things, that he was cursed, that he carried a demon in his throat. For days, Samuel was silent, refusing to speak. He followed his mother around like a shadow, afraid of the words that might slip out if his lips opened again. And he would not play with the other children, who now taunted him with cruel names, Death's Echo, Corpse Tongue, Grave Child. At night he would wake screaming, his voice carrying fragments of phrases that belonged to no one he knew. His mother would hold him close, pressing her hand against his mouth as if she could cage the words inside him. Yet the village watched. Farmers paused in their fields when he walked by. Old women crossed themselves. The blacksmith spat on the ground whenever Samuel came near. The boy had spoken the last words of a dying woman, and no one could forget it. And Samuel himself could never escape it. For every time he closed his eyes, he heard voices in the dark, soft, broken, endless voices, waiting for him to breathe them into the world. It was only the beginning. It was only the 2 years passed, and Samuel grew from a fragile child into a quiet, watchful boy. He was 8 years old now, but unlike others his age, he did not laugh in the fields or shout in the streets. His silence was deliberate, a shield he had built around himself. For Samuel had learned the truth. When he spoke, the words were not always his own. The villagers noticed. When he passed by, his lips pressed shut, his eyes lowered. They whispered that he was hiding the voices of the dead inside him. Some feared him, others pitied him, but none welcomed him. Even the children who had once mocked him no longer dared. Instead, they kept their distance, as though some invisible sickness clung to his shadow. His mother, weary and worn from both grief and gossip, tried to protect him. "He is just a boy," she insisted to the priest. "He carries no curse, only sorrow." But even she knew that something unnatural lived in her son. At night, when the wind crept through the cracks of their cottage, Samuel would wake, lips moving in the dark, murmuring words she did not understand. Sometimes they were fragments of prayers, sometimes pleas for forgiveness, sometimes chillingly, they were the last gasps of strangers who had not yet died. The priest, troubled by the rumors, came to see Samuel himself. He found the boy sitting by the hearth, carving lines into the dirt with a stick. "Speak, child," the priest urged gently. "Say anything. A prayer, a hymn." Samuel raised his eyes, hollow, heavy, and parted his lips. The words that came forth were not his. "The water is cold. I cannot breathe. Tell them I love them." The priest froze. Hours later, a fisherman's body was dragged from the river, his lungs filled with water, his wife weeping on the bank. From that day, even the priest kept his distance. He told the villagers Samuel was a test from God, but he himself lit candles long into the night, his prayers muttered with trembling lips. Samuel, meanwhile, withdrew further. He avoided the church, the market, the laughter of the children. He spent his days wandering the edges of the woods, pressing his hands over his ears as though the silence of the trees might drown out the endless whispers clawing at his mind. But silence never came. The voices always returned. He began to feel them building inside him, restless, impatient. At times his throat would tighten, as if the words were fighting to escape. He would clamp his jaw shut until it ached, his body trembling, his eyes wet with tears. He did not want to speak. He knew what speaking meant, but curses cannot be contained forever. By the spring of 1883, Samuel could no longer hold the voices back. They broke free in the most public of places, in front of the eyes of a village that already half believed, half feared. The boy who would not speak was about to speak again, and this time, no one would be able to deny what he was. By the spring of 1883, Samuel had become less a boy and more a shadow. He walked the cobblestones with his head lowered, his lips pressed tightly shut, as though afraid that even a single careless word might unleash something he could never take back. Yet for all his silence, the villagers could not ignore him. They watched him with a mixture of suspicion and dread, whispering behind their hands. They knew the day would come when his voice returned. That day arrived in the marketplace. The morning was damp, the streets slick from the previous night's rain. The villagers gathered to barter for bread, milk, and meat, their voices rising in the usual chorus of bargaining and gossip. Samuel wandered among them, quiet, his eyes moving from face to face as though he were listening to something none of them could hear. He stopped at the butcher's stall. The man was broad-shouldered, his hands red with work, his knives laid neatly in a row. Samuel stood before him for a long time, his lips trembling. The butcher frowned. "What do you want, boy?" Samuel's throat worked as if something inside him struggled to break free. Then, in a voice that was his and not his, he whispered, "Tell Anna, I never meant to leave her so soon." The crowd fell silent. The butcher's face drained of color. His knife slipped from his hand and clattered against the stone. He staggered backward, eyes wide, as though struck by a blow. For a heartbeat, the market was frozen in stillness. Then, with a strangled cry, the butcher collapsed. Blood flecked his lips. His final word was, "Anna." The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Men and women stared at Samuel as though he had conjured death itself. Mothers clutched their children close. Some villagers crossed themselves, others backed away, muttering curses. Samuel said nothing more. He only stood there, pale and trembling, his eyes brimming with tears. He had not wished this. He had not wanted the words to escape. Yet they had torn themselves free from his throat, as unstoppable as the butcher's fall to the ground. From that day forward, no one doubted him. Samuel was no longer just a strange, quiet boy. He was an omen. His mouth carried the last words of the dying, his tongue bound to a truth too terrible for a child to bear. The villagers avoided him, stepping aside when he passed, spitting on the ground as if to ward off his curse. But avoidance was not enough. Fear grew into obsession. Every glance he gave, every moment his lips twitched, was enough to send waves of panic through the crowd. Who would he speak for next? And worse, when would he speak their words? After the butcher's death, the village was never the same. Every corner, every shadow, every hushed voice carried Samuel's name. Men muttered it as a curse, women whispered it as a warning, and children, once playful tormentors, now ran at the mere sight of him. Samuel had become a figure no one wished to cross paths with, an omen walking among them. The market square where the butcher fell remained tainted. People swore they still heard his final gasp echo against the stones when night settled in. Merchants avoided setting up their stalls near that spot, and when forced to, they made the sign of the cross or scattered salt to ward off evil. But none of it mattered, because the true terror was not the memory of the butcher, it was the boy himself. Samuel's mother tried desperately to shield him. She pulled him from the market, kept him indoors, and urged him never to leave her side. But the whispers reached even their walls. Neighbors knocked less, friends stopped visiting, and food became harder to barter for. Samuel had not only lost his place among the children of the village, he had become a burden his mother could no longer hide. At night, the fear pressed hardest. The villagers heard him. His small voice carried through thin cottage walls, reciting words that made no sense to the living. I forgive you, though I never saw your face. The earth is cold, I can't see the light. My child, don't cry, I'll still be near. The phrases seeped into their dreams, leaving them restless, waking in sweat. Some swore the boy was summoning death itself, calling it nearer to their doors. The priest, unable to ignore the growing unrest, gathered the townsfolk in the church one evening. By the light of candles, their faces flickered with fear. He raised his voice over the murmurs. Samuel is not cursed. He is afflicted, but he is still a child of God. But the words did little. A farmer stood and spat on the floor. A child of God does not speak death. He carries it. Another woman clutched her shawl tightly. My husband is sick. What if the boy speaks his words next? What if he brings it sooner? A murmur of agreement filled the church. Fear, once scattered, was becoming united. Samuel's mother, clutching her son's hand, pleaded with them. He never asked for this. He suffers more than any of you. Would you punish a boy for what he cannot control? But their faces told her the truth. Fear does not forgive. Fear demands sacrifice. That night, as Samuel lay awake, he heard them outside. Low voices, plotting, the crunch of boots in the dirt. His mother sat at the window, her shoulders trembling as she watched torches pass by in the dark. The village was turning. It was no longer a question of whether they would come for him, but when. And Samuel knew. When they came, he would not be silent. The night was thick with fog when the knock came. It was not the polite tapping of a neighbor, nor the hurried fist of someone desperate for help. It was heavy, deliberate, and final. Samuel sat upright in his bed, his small body stiff with dread. His mother froze by the hearth, her hands trembling over the bowl she had been washing. She knew this moment had been coming, though she had prayed each day that it might never arrive. Stay inside, she whispered, pushing Samuel toward the corner. Do not speak. No matter what happens, keep your mouth closed. But Samuel knew as well as she did that silence was not his to command. The voices pressed at his throat, restless, eager. The dying never slept. When she opened the door, the night spilled in, bringing with it the faces of the villagers lit by torchlight. The priest stood among them, his candle raised high, but it was not his voice that carried across the threshold. It was the farmer, the same man who had cursed Samuel in the church. His words cut through the fog like a blade. We cannot live like this anymore. Every step he takes, every breath he draws, is a curse upon us all. Death follows him. If he remains, none of us are safe. Murmurs of agreement swelled. Behind them a woman clutched her shawl tighter, her eyes darting toward the boy's shadow in the window. My husband is sick, she cried. If the child speaks his words, he'll be gone before the week is out. The priest raised a trembling hand. We must not condemn him. He is innocent of what he carries. But even his voice faltered, for he too feared what the boy might say. Samuel's mother stepped forward, her body a shield in the doorway. He is only a boy, she cried. He suffers more than any of you. Would you kill a child to silence your own fear? Her words only fanned the fire. The farmer spat on the ground. If we do nothing, more will die. Lou, look at the butcher. Who will be next? Perhaps me, perhaps you. Will you wait until it is your child he speaks for? The crowd pressed closer, their faces hardened, their fear given shape in anger. Samuel, crouched in the corner, could feel the weight of their hatred pressing through the walls. His throat burned. Words rose inside him, clawing for escape. He bit his lip until it bled, his small fists clenched against his mouth. But the voices were relentless. And then, through the roar of the crowd, Samuel spoke. His voice was faint at first, but clear, carrying words that belonged to none of them. The rope burns my neck. Tell them I did not steal. Tell them I was innocent. The crowd went silent. Every face turned toward the boy in the window. In the hush, a man in the back gasped and stumbled forward. His brother had been hanged years ago for a theft he swore he did not commit. The torches flickered. The villagers stared at Samuel as though he were no longer a boy, but a mouthpiece for the grave itself. Fear deepened into something darker. Not only did Samuel speak for the dying, he spoke for the dead. And the dead, it seemed, were not finished speaking. The silence after Samuel's words was heavier than the fog that blanketed the village. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the sputtering crackle of torches, their light casting warped shadows across the cottage walls. The man whose brother had been hanged knelt in the dirt, tears streaking his face, whispering prayers of both grief and terror. Samuel had given voice to a ghost, and in doing so, confirmed what the villagers feared most. Samuel was no longer just the echo of the dying. He was now the mouth of the dead. The farmer seized the moment, his voice booming above the hushed crowd. "You see, he calls the spirits. He drags them into our homes. This boy will not stop until every one of us lies in the ground." The villagers murmured, their fear weaving into agreement. Some crossed themselves, others clutched their children tighter, but their eyes all pointed in the same direction, toward the boy, cowering inside the cottage. Samuel's mother stood firm in the doorway, her face pale but defiant. "He is my son. You will not take him." The priest, torn between faith and fear, lifted his candle. "Perhaps the boy carries a burden none of us understand. If he is chosen, then perhaps he is meant to suffer for us, not against us." But his words fell flat. The crowd's fear had hardened into resolve. Fear, when left unchecked, always demands blood. A voice rose from the back. A woman, old and hunched, her eyes sharp as glass. "In the old days," she said, "a child marked by death would be cast out, so the curse could not spread. It is mercy, not cruelty. Let him go into the wild, and if God wills it, he will live. If not—" She left the rest unsaid, but the meaning was clear. The crowd seized on her words. Exile, banishment. It was not murder, but it was enough. Samuel's mother's heart broke at the murmurs. She turned to the priest, her voice whined. "Is raw with desperation. You cannot let them do this. He is only a child. Where will he go? How will he live?" The priest could not meet her eyes. His candle trembled in his hand. It may be the only way to save him, and the only way to save the village. Inside the cottage, Samuel pressed his hands against his ears, but the voices were louder than ever. They poured into him like water through cracks, choking him, demanding to be spoken. He whispered fragments under his breath. "It hurts. I can't breathe. Why did you leave me?" The words were a chorus of suffering, and even through the walls the villagers heard them. Their fear erupted into shouts. "Exile him! Send him away before he damns us all! Cast him out!" His mother fell to her knees, sobbing, clinging to Samuel as though her body alone could hold him in the world, but she knew deep down that the village had already decided. By dawn, Samuel would no longer belong to the living. He would belong to the silence of the wild. The dawn came cold and grey, as though the sky itself recoiled from what the village was about to do. Samuel's mother clutched his hand so tightly his fingers ached, but she would not let go. Not yet. Outside their cottage, the villagers gathered in silence, their torches reduced to smouldering stubs, their faces set with grim resolve. No one sang hymns. No one offered prayer. This was not a holy act. It was a fearful one. The priest stood among them, his head bowed, his candle extinguished. He had lost the strength to argue, and in his silence the crowd found permission. The farmer stepped forward with a rope, not to bind Samuel's hands, but to drive him like cattle. His mother rose in fury, blocking the doorway. "You will not treat him as an animal!" she cried. Her voice cracked, but her eyes blazed. The farmer spat into the dirt. "He is worse than an animal. At least beasts do not carry death on their tongues." With that, the crowd surged. Samuel's mother fought, clawed, begged, but there were too many. They pulled Samuel from her arms, and though he did not struggle, his body shook with terror. His lips quivered, words threatening to escape, but he bit them down until his mouth filled with the taste of blood. They dragged him beyond the fields, past the river that wound black and endless through the land. The woods loomed ahead, dark and cold, a place where no villager dared wander after dusk. Wolves prowled there. Spirits were said to linger between the trees. To be cast into the wild was to be handed to death itself. At the forest's edge, they shoved Samuel forward. His mother fell to her knees, reaching out, her cries breaking the morning air. "Please, not my boy! He is all I have!" But the villagers pulled her back, their faces hard, their eyes averted. Even pity was too dangerous. Samuel turned once, his small figure framed against the rising light. His mother's face was streaked with tears, her arms outstretched toward him. He wanted to call out, to speak words that were his own, but his throat burned. When he opened his mouth, what came instead was a whisper. "The earth is cold. I am afraid." The villagers recoiled. Some crossed themselves, others spit on the ground. The farmer shoved him hard. "Go, before you damn us further!" Samuel stumbled into the trees. The woods swallowed him whole, their branches clawing at his clothes, their shadows wrapping around him. Behind him, the villagers turned away, leaving his mother sobbing in the dirt. The sound of her grief followed him into the silence of the forest until it faded into nothing. Night fell quickly beneath the canopy. Samuel huddled beneath the roots of a great oak, his body trembling with hunger and fear. The voices did not leave him. They pressed close in the darkness, filling his ears, his chest, his throat. And for the first time, Samuel realized the truth. Out here in the wild, there were no villagers to fear his words. There was only him and the dead. The forest did not welcome him. It watched. Every creak of the branches, every rustle in the undergrowth carried with it the sensation of eyes. Samuel wandered the first day with trembling legs, his hunger gnawing at his belly, his lips cracked from thirst. He found a stream and drank greedily, but even the water tasted strange, metallic, as though tinged with something long dead. At night, the voices grew stronger. They no longer whispered one by one. They came in dozens, overlapping, crowding his small mind until he could scarcely tell where his thoughts ended and theirs began. Some were pleading, others accusing, some still gasping with the shock of death. They filled the darkness around him, pressing against his ears, his chest, his bones. Samuel curled against the roots of an oak, covering his ears, rocking as though motion alone might quiet them, but silence never came. On the second night, something shifted. Amid the endless cries, he heard a new voice. It was not the voice of the dying or the dead. It was low, deliberate and steady, cutting clean through the chaos. "Samuel." He froze. The name had never passed from the lips of the dead before. His heart hammered. "Who's there?" he whispered, though he already knew no one stood near. The forest answered with stillness. Then the voice returned. "You carry them all, but you do not have to suffer alone." Samuel pressed his back to the tree, his breath sharp and shallow. "What do you mean?" His voice cracked, trembling with both fear and hope. The air grew colder. He felt it coil around him, a chill not of wind but of presence. "You give them life when you speak. You are their vessel. You could be more than that." The boy shook his head violently. "I don't want them. I don't want any of this." His words broke into sobs, but the voices around him only swelled, echoing in waves. "It hurts. Help me. Don't let of me," until he thought his skull might split apart. The steady voice cut through them again. "Then give them to me." Samuel's sobbing ceased. His wide eyes darted into the darkness between the trees, but nothing moved. The forest floor was still, yet he felt the weight of something vast and unseen crouched just beyond the reach of firelight. "Speak them," the voice commanded. "Let them pass through you into me. Free yourself." His lips parted. The words clawed at his throat, desperate to be released. For a moment he almost obeyed, but then he remembered his mother's arms, her trembling voice pleading for him to stay silent, to survive. Samuel clenched his jaw until it ached. "No," he whispered hoarsely. "They are mine to bear." The forest shivered around him. The other voices rose again, louder, angrier, more desperate, as if enraged by his refusal. The steady voice faded, leaving only the relentless chorus of the dead. Samuel curled tighter into himself, knowing that in the wild he had not been abandoned to silence. He had been abandoned to something worse, something that now knew his name. Winter came early that year. The forest grew cruel, its branches heavy with snow, its silence broken only by the cracking of ice. Samuel, gaunt and hollow-eyed, had survived the autumn on berries, scraps, and whatever kindness the land begrudgingly offered. Yet it was not hunger that hollowed him most. It was the voices. They no longer waited for him to sleep. They filled his waking hours, spilling from every shadow, whispering in every gust of wind. The dead begged him to speak them into the world, and when he resisted, they clawed at him from within, tearing at his chest, his throat, his mind. He began to lose track of his own voice. When he muttered to himself, he was never certain whether the words were his or theirs. And still, that steady voice returned. Not every night, not always, but often enough to remind him it had not left. "You cannot fight them forever." Samuel would tremble, clutching his ears, but it made no difference. The voice was not outside him, it was in him, woven into the same place where the dying and the dead lived. "You were cast out because they feared you. But fear is power, Samuel. You can give it shape. You can make them remember you." At first, Samuel resisted. He thought of his mother, her face wet with tears, her arms reaching for him as the villagers tore him away. He thought of the small boy he once was, afraid of the dark, clinging to silence as though it could save him. But silence no longer existed. The forest had devoured it, and in its place, only the voices remained. One night, the dead broke him. He woke gasping, his chest heaving as dozens of voices screamed at once, each clawing to be heard. His throat convulsed until the words poured from him in a torrent. Last confessions, unfinished prayers, endless fragments of suffering. He screamed them into the night, and as he did, the forest seemed to move with him. The wind rose, red, branches cracked, the earth trembled faintly beneath his knees. When his voice finally broke, when silence returned, Samuel was no longer the same. His lips were bloodied, his body weak, but something in his eyes had changed. He had spoken not as a boy repeating the dead, but as something larger, something that had gathered them, carried them, and released them as a single, terrible chorus. The steady voice came once more, soft but triumphant. "You see? You are not their victim. You are their mouth. Through you, they live. Through you, they are feared." Samuel did not answer. He stood slowly, his body trembling, his breath misting in the cold air. The forest was silent now, not empty, but waiting. He felt it in his bones. The dead had not left him. They had become him. And in that moment, Samuel understood what the villagers never had. He was no longer just a boy, cursed to speak last words. He was becoming the voice of death itself. The boy the villagers had cast into the wilderness was not the one who walked back years later. Snow clung to Samuel's ragged clothes as he emerged from the tree line, his frame taller now but gaunt, his eyes sunken yet burning with an unnatural clarity. He moved without hesitation, as though he knew every path, every door, every face before him. The village had not forgotten him. Whispers spread like fire as the first child spotted him at the edge of the square. Mothers pulled their children close, men reached for tools, and the church bell was struck, not in welcome, but in warning. Samuel did not speak. He stood at the center of the square, staring at them, at the very people who had dragged him from his mother's arms. His lips trembled, not with fear, but with something closer to grief. Then the voices began, not in whispers this time, but in a rolling tide. Dozens, then hundreds of last words poured from him, one after another, faster than breath could allow. The villagers froze as the words of their long-dead kin, their ancestors, their forgotten neighbors, echoed from the boy's mouth. The cries of plague victims, the soldiers who never returned from war, the children buried in shallow graves. The air itself seemed to bend beneath the sound. Some villagers fell to their knees, clutching their ears, sobbing. Others ran, but found the paths out of the square blocked by nothing visible, as though the very air pressed them back. The church bell tolled once more, then cracked down its middle, silenced forever. Samuel's mother stumbled from the crowd, her face pale, her eyes wide with both terror and recognition. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, stop." For the first time since his return, Samuel faltered. The voices hesitated, trembling at the edge of his lips. He looked at her, and in his eyes flickered the smallest remnant of the boy he had once been. But then the steady voice spoke inside him again, low, commanding, final. "You are not theirs. You are mine." Samuel shuddered. His mother reached for him, her hands trembling. For one desperate moment, it seemed he might reach back. But his mouth opened once more, and what poured out was no longer merely the words of the dead. It was the sound of death itself. The villagers screamed as the square filled with a chorus that was not human, not earthly, but endless, a sound of finality, of endings, of graves opening and closing all at once. Some dropped dead where they stood. Others fled into the night, never to return. When at last the voices ceased, Samuel stood alone in the silent square. His mother lay collapsed at his feet, her hand outstretched toward him. He did not weep. He did not speak. He only turned, walking back toward the forest, the voices now quiet within him. Not gone, but satisfied. The village would rebuild, but it would never forget. And from that night on, parents warned their children of the boy who carried the last words of the dying, who returned only once, and who left silence that was worse than death.